She did everything right, fought for his kingdom, bled for his people, loved his son into the world with her own body. And when the lie came, he believed it over her. One signature. That was all it took. One signature on a decree she never saw, and Luna Serena Vale stopped existing. They didn't kill her. That would have been kinder. They opened the gate and watched her walk out carrying a child and a bag and nothing else, and every single person in that courtyard let it happen. If you've ever been betrayed by someone who should have known better, drop your city in the comments. Stay until the end. What happened next is not what anyone expected. Part 1. The gate closes. The morning they exiled her, it rained. Not the violent kind of rain that cracks the sky open and makes the whole world feel dramatic. The thin, gray, indifferent kind. The kind that soaks through wool slowly and finds the back of your neck and doesn't stop. Serena stood in the eastern courtyard of Thornkeep with Orion pressed against her side, one hand gripping his small shoulder, her travel bag hanging from the other. She had packed it herself in the dark at 4 a.m, while 2 palace guards stood in the doorway of her chamber and watched, arms crossed, not speaking. She had folded Orion's clothes first. That was the thing she remembered later. Not what she said to Darius, not the sound of the decree being read aloud, not the faces in the hall that wouldn't meet her eyes. She remembered the way she folded Orion's spare shirt with the same care she always had, pressing the seams flat with her thumb, because the boy needed to know that whatever was happening, she had not lost her hands. Orion was 6. He was too young to understand the word exile. He understood his mother's breathing. "Are we going on a trip?" he asked, against her coat. "Yes," she said. "Where?" "I don't know yet." He accepted this. She felt his fingers curl into the fabric at her hip, and she did not allow herself to look down at him because if she did, she would come apart, and she could not afford to come apart inside these walls. Not where they could see it, not where they could use it. The courtyard held 43 people. She counted them while the decree was being read. It was something she had learned in her years as Luna. Count what is in front of you. Count the bodies. Count the exits. Count what you have and what you're missing. The head chamberlain stood to the left of the gate with the rolled document in his hands, his voice flat and official, reading words she already knew by heart because Darius had spoken them to her the night before in the private council room with the fire too high and his eyes not quite on hers. Conspiracy against the pack, unauthorized contact with the Morden Syndicate, breach of the Luna's oath of loyalty. None of it was true. All of it was documented. That was the part that still caught in her chest like a splinter. Not the accusation itself, but the paperwork. Ledgers with her signature, correspondence with her seal, meeting records with her name. Someone had spent months building that case. Someone who knew her schedule, her handwriting, the exact phrasing she used in formal correspondence. Someone who had been close enough to study her. She had not figured out who yet. That was the stone in her shoe on the long walk to the gate. Not the exile, not even Darius, but the fact that she did not yet know the name of the person who had done this, and she was being made to leave before she could find it. The chamberlain finished reading. He rolled the document with practiced efficiency, like closing a book at the end of a chapter. "Luna Serena Vale," he said, "by decree of Alpha Darius Thorn, your title, your rank, and your residence within the borders of the Thorn Pack are hereby revoked. You are given safe passage to the border and no further claim on pack resources. Do you accept these terms?" "I accept nothing," Serena said. It came out quieter than she intended, flat. The rain put a curtain of sound over everything. The chamberlain's eyes flickered. "The decree stands regardless of—" "I know it does," she said. "I'm not arguing the decree. I'm telling you I accept nothing. Write that down somewhere." He didn't write it down. The gate opened. She had thought, she had halfway convinced herself, that Darius would be there, that he would stand at the top of the steps above the courtyard and watch, and she would be able to look at his face one final time and understand something about the man she had married. 7 years. She had believed she knew him better than any person in the world. She had trusted that knowledge the way you trust the floor. Not consciously, just as a given, as the thing that holds you up without needing to be thought about. He was not in the courtyard. She looked for him. She made herself stop looking. She took Orion's hand and she walked toward the gate. There were faces she recognized in those 43. Maida, who had served as her personal attendant for 4 years, stood near the eastern wall, with her hands folded in front of her and her eyes on the cobblestones. Councillor Brecht, who had eaten at her table and called her the finest political mind in 3 territories, had found something important to study on the middle distance to her left. Holt, the captain of the Luna's guard, her guard, stood at parade rest and looked straight through her with military blankness, as though she had already ceased to exist. She understood what she was watching. She had read enough history to know the name for it. When power shifts, people recalibrate. It was not personal. People did not choose cowardice because they hated you. They chose it because they needed to eat, because they had children, because they did not know how the story was going to end, and they couldn't afford to bet on the wrong side. She understood it. She catalogued it. She did not forgive it. The gate was heavy ironwood banded with steel, and the sound it made closing behind her was a sound she would carry in her body for the rest of her life. Not loud, not dramatic, just a long, grinding, final kind of thud, and then the latch engaging, and then silence, except for the rain. Orion looked back over his shoulder at the walls. "Mama." "Don't look back," she said. "I want to see—" "I know, don't look back." He turned forward. She kept walking. The road south from Thornkeep ran through forest for the first 12 miles before it hit open ground. Serena had traveled it 100 times in a carriage. She had never walked it. The mud was bad in the rain. Her boots were court boots, not traveling boots. She had not been permitted time to arrange otherwise. And within the first mile, the leather at her left heel had started to rub. Within 3 miles, the skin was gone. She didn't stop walking. Orion was quiet for a long time, which was unusual. He was a child who talked in the way some rivers ran, constantly, around and over everything, filling in silence automatically. His quiet now was a form of alertness. She could feel him reading the situation through the grip of her hand, through the pace she was setting, through the particular set of her shoulders. "Are you scared?" he asked, somewhere around the 2nd mile. She thought about lying. She had always tried not to lie to him about things that mattered. "A little," she said. "I'm a little scared, too." "That's honest." "Are you going to fix it?" She looked down at him. He looked up at her. His eyes were Darius's shape, but her color, pale gray, nearly silver, the kind of eyes that caught light in unusual ways. He had mud on his cheek. His hair was wet. He looked like someone who had just found out something important about the world and was waiting to learn whether that knowledge was survivable. "Yes," she said. "Promise?" "I promise." She meant it. She had no idea how, but she meant it with the whole of her body, the way you mean things when there is nothing left to lose by meaning them completely. They made the border by early afternoon. The thorn-packed southeastern border was a river called the Greywater, wide, cold, fed by the mountains in the northeast. There was a crossing point a mile downstream of the main road, a bridge that merchants used. The 2 pack soldiers who had been tasked with escorting her to the border, young, both of them, neither willing to speak or look at her, stopped at the edge of the bridge and waited. Their instruction was to confirm she crossed. That was all. Serena stopped at the edge and turned around. The 2 soldiers both startled slightly, as though they had not expected this. "You're both going to remember today," she said. Neither of them answered. "Not because you were cruel," she said. "You weren't, but you were present. And that makes you witnesses. Keep that somewhere. It'll matter later." The younger of the 2, he couldn't have been more than 20, with the kind of patchy beard that suggested he was still hoping for a better one, swallowed visibly. The older one kept his face blank. Serena turned back to the bridge, took Orion's hand and walked across. On the other side, the Greywater sounded different. The same river, but the light was different here. The trees were different, and the sound of the water seemed louder. Or maybe the sound of the kingdom behind her was simply gone. She stopped walking. Orion stopped with her. She looked at the tree line ahead, the mud path winding through it, the gray sky above. She took stock. Travel bag, 1 change of clothes each, a winter blanket folded small, 3 days of dried provisions she had anticipated they would not give her, and had quietly assembled herself over the previous week. Money. The pack had stripped her of pack accounts and formal holdings, but she had kept her personal funds separate for years. A habit, not a plan. The habit of someone who had spent enough time in politics to know that formal holdings were the first thing taken. She had approximately 60 silver marks sewn into the lining of her coat, enough to travel, enough to buy a few nights of shelter, not enough to stop moving. Skills, everything she had learned in 7 years as Luna of the largest pack in the Northern Territories. 3 years before that in her father's diplomatic service. The ability to read a room, to negotiate, to identify what people wanted and find the angle where what they wanted aligned with what she needed. The ability to hold a plan in her head while responding to what was actually happening. The ability to keep going when she had already been going long enough that continuing seemed like the least reasonable option. She had Orion. She had 60 silver marks. She had her mind. This was the accounting. It took approximately 30 seconds. Then she picked up the bag, resettled it on her shoulder, and started walking. The first 3 nights, they slept in a traveler's way station 6 miles south of the border. A rough wood structure meant for merchants moving between territories, equipped with a fire pit, a water barrel, and nothing else. Serena was grateful for the fire pit. The nights were cold, and Orion's immunity to weather had limits, and she had not brought enough blankets because she had packed for the child first and herself second. She slept in her coat. She let Orion have both changes of clothes layered for warmth. He didn't complain. She watched him learn not to complain the same way she watched him learn everything, by observation, by mimicking her, by some internal logic she recognized as her own. On the second night he woke in the small hours and found her sitting up by the fire, and he climbed into her lap without asking and sat there while she stared into the coals. "Are you thinking?" he asked. "Yes." "About bad things?" She considered the question. The fire cracked. Outside the way station walls, something moved through the dark undergrowth. A deer, probably, or something larger. "I'm thinking about what comes next," she said. "Is what comes next bad?" "Some of it will be, some of it won't." "But you know what to do?" "Some of it. I'm figuring the rest out." "Okay," he said, and leaned back against her chest and fell asleep again, apparently satisfied with this as a resolution. She held him and kept thinking. The nearest city of any size was Aldenmark, 4 days' walk south. It was a trade city, plural pack territory, technically neutral ground where pack politics didn't carry, where her name and her former title wouldn't function as either a credential or a liability, where she could move as an unknown. She needed to reach it. She needed to figure out, in the interim, whether to approach it as a refugee or as something else, because those were 2 different strategies with 2 very different trajectories. On the 3rd morning, she made a decision. She was not going to approach any of this as a refugee. A refugee was someone whose story had been written by someone else. She had spent the last 48 hours being processed by other people's decisions, other people's decrees, other people's silences, other people's cowardice. She was done being a subject in a story she hadn't authored. Whatever she was going to build on the other side of that bridge, she was going to build it as someone with a strategy, not as someone who was simply surviving long enough to find out what happened next. The distinction was subtle. It was also everything. She reached Aldenmark on the 5th day, 1 day behind her estimated pace due to a washed-out section of road that required a long detour east. Her left heel had developed a blister the size of her thumb that had burst and begun to harden. She had 2 silver marks less than she'd started with, spent on a night in a real lodging house midway through the journey, and a meal for Orion that she had largely not eaten herself because he had been hungry and she could manage on less. Aldenmark smelled like fish and coal smoke and horse. It sat at the junction of 2 rivers, and it had the sprawling, provisional quality of cities that had started as trade stops and expanded without anyone planning for expansion. Streets that didn't line up, buildings in 4 different architectural styles pressed against each other with casual disregard, market stalls overflowing into the roads. The noise of it after 5 days in forest and empty road was physical. Orion pressed close without being asked. She found them lodging at an inn near the merchant quarters. 4 stories, clean enough, the kind of place traveling traders used. Not cheap, but not flagrant. She paid for a week with a calculation behind it. A week gave her time to establish something before she needed to worry about the next week. The innkeeper was a heavy-set woman with close-cut gray hair and hands that had seen a great deal of hard work. She looked at Serena the way people in trade cities looked at everyone who came through, assessing, neutral, not unkind. "Just the two of you?" she said. "Just the two of us." "Long journey?" "Long enough." The woman nodded and slid the key across the desk. She didn't ask anything else. This was one of the things Serena was learning to value about neutral territory. People here were too busy with their own business to be curious about yours. The room was small, clean, with 2 narrow beds and a window that faced the courtyard. Orion went immediately to the window and watched the courtyard below with the focused attention of a child who had been deprived of other people for several days and was now recalibrating. "There's a dog down there," he said. Can we get a dog?" "Not right now." "Later?" "Maybe later." She sat on the edge of one of the beds and took her boot off and looked at her heel. The hardened skin had cracked again during the last miles. She pressed her thumb against the edge of it and did not react to the pain. "Mama, you're hurt." "I'll manage it." "You should tell someone." "I'm telling you." He turned from the window. He had his father's brow, that particular slight furrow that appeared when he was processing something important. She had always found it useful on Darius. She had always been able to read the exact moment he moved from reacting to thinking. On Orion, it was the same tell. "Why did Papa make us leave?" he said. She had been waiting for this question. She had been composing versions of an answer for 5 days. "He believed something that wasn't true," she said. "About you?" "Yes." "Did you tell him it wasn't true?" "Yes." "And he didn't believe you?" "He chose not to." Orion looked at her for a long moment. He was 6, but there were things about him that were not 6. Ways of sitting with information that suggested he was doing something complex and unhurried with it before arriving at a conclusion. "That was wrong of him," he said. "Yes," she said. "It was." "Is he going to fix it?" "I don't think he knows how to yet." "Will you fix it?" "I'm going to build something better," she said, which isn't the same thing as fixing what he broke, but it's what I have available. He thought about this for a moment. Then he turned back to the window. "The dog is eating something," he said. "Probably it's dinner." "I'm hungry." "We'll eat when I've dealt with my heel," she said, and got up and went to the basin. In Aldenmarsh, she started with what she knew. She spent the first 2 days watching, not participating, watching. She walked the market quarter with Orion at her side, tracking the patterns of trade, identifying who the significant players were, what the tensions and the opportunities were. Aldenmark at this particular moment was sitting on a problem. 3 major merchant consortiums in the territory had been in a slow escalating conflict for the past year over river access rights, and it had recently tipped into something more volatile. She gathered this from overheard conversation in the market, from the way certain stalls clustered or avoided each other, from the 3 separate broadsheets available at the paper sellers on the main street, each one clearly aligned with a different faction, and each one printing a version of events that barely overlapped with the others. She was not a merchant. She had no position here, but she had spent 7 years managing the internal politics of a pack with 43 noble families, each with their own history and grievances, and the mechanics of that were not fundamentally different from the mechanics of what she was watching in Aldenmark. The tools were the same. Only the arena had changed. On the 3rd day, she approached the smallest of the 3 consortiums. Their offices were in a converted warehouse on the south bank of the smaller river, unpretentious, slightly defensive in their positioning, the kind of headquarters that suggested they were accustomed to being underestimated. She went without appointment. She stated her name as Serena Vale, offered no other title, and asked to speak with whoever made decisions. The person who made decisions turned out to be a woman named Tasca Miran, probably 50, with the wiry, focused quality of someone who had been doing difficult work for a long time. She received Serena in a small office on the upper floor with the door open and 2 of her own people clearly visible in the hallway outside, which Serena read as exactly what it was: cautious, not hostile. "You don't have a company affiliation," Tasca Miran said, looking at the visiting card Serena had passed in with the door request. It stated her name and nothing else. "I'm a consultant," Serena said. This was not a lie. She had simply decided 5 minutes before arriving that this was what she was. For who? Currently, no one. I'm new to Aldenmark. And you're here because? Because you have a problem with river access, and the Dunmore Consortium has more lawyers than you do, and I have a background in complex negotiation that might be useful. Tascamiran looked at her with the flat, measuring gaze of someone who had been approached by a great many people claiming to be useful. "What kind of background?" she said. "The kind that isn't available to verify at the moment," Serena said, "which is why I'm not asking for payment. I'm asking to sit in on your next meeting with the River Authority. Observer status. No obligations on either side. And if you're wasting my time, then you've lost 2 hours and a cup of whatever you're drinking." Tasca looked at her for a long moment. Serena held the look without filling the silence. The silence was a tool. She had learned long ago that people who were afraid of silence filled it with concessions. 2 hours, Tasca said. That's all I need. The meeting with the River Authority happened the following morning. Serena sat against the wall and said nothing for the first hour and 40 minutes. She watched the River Authority's representative, a man named Gled, middle-aged, technically competent, and visibly bored, and she watched the Tascamiran's lead negotiator work through their prepared arguments, and she watched the small tells of interest and disengagement on Gled's face. At the 1 hour 50 mark, Tasca looked at her. Serena spoke for 8 minutes. She addressed Gled directly, reframed the access question in terms of the River Authority's own charter language, rather than commercial law, and identified a procedural pathway that the authority had available to them that would resolve the dispute without requiring a ruling, which Gled had been quietly trying to avoid for 6 months, because any ruling would offend one of the larger consortiums. Gled looked interested in a way he had not looked interested previously. "Who are you?" he said. "A consultant," Serena said. "With whom?" "Currently independent." He looked at her for a moment, then at Tasca. "I'd like to continue this conversation," he said, on a more formal basis. After he left, Tascamiran sat in the meeting room for a moment and looked at Serena. "Where did you come from?" she said. "The north," Serena said. "What happened in the north?" Serena met her eyes. "The kind of thing that pushes you out of one life and into another," she said. "Is that too vague?" Tasca seemed to consider the question and decide it was adequate for now. "My rate for consultants is," she started. "I don't want a rate," Serena said. "I want a desk, access to your correspondence archives for the past 2 years, and introductions to 2 of the foreign trade delegations currently in the city. What I do with those introductions is my business. In exchange, I'll continue to assist with the River Authority situation and whatever else comes up in the next month." Tasca looked at her. "That's an unusual arrangement." "I'm building something," Serena said. "The river situation is useful practice. The introductions are what I actually need." There was a long pause. "You're not what I expected when someone walked in off the street," Tasca said. "What did you expect?" "Someone who wanted a job." "I already have a job," Serena said. "I'm figuring out the title." Over the weeks that followed, Serena worked. Not performing, not surviving, working the way she had always worked at her best, which was with complete attention and without any particular concern for what people thought of her while she was doing it. The river access dispute resolved in 6 weeks via the procedural pathway she had identified. Tascamiran's consortium improved its position significantly. Gled at the River Authority received a solution that let him close a file he'd had open for 2 years. Everyone ended up with something useful. The introductions Tasca provided led to 3 foreign trade delegates currently in Aldenmark. Serena attended their functions, spoke carefully, said less than she knew. She was cataloging, building a map of the larger landscape she was now operating in. The Morden territories to the southeast were in a period of political reconfiguration. The Vaethora Highlands were experiencing a trade surplus that their existing partnerships couldn't absorb. The Silver Corridor, a strip of neutral territory connecting 6 independent cities, had been slowly losing infrastructure for a decade, and no single power had stepped in to address it. She sat with this information over several weeks. turning it the way you turn a stone to find what's underneath. And in the evening, she came back to the inn room. They were still at the same inn. The arrangement had evolved from a week into something more permanent. And Orion did his lessons at the table, and she cooked on the small brazier in the corner, and they talked. He was adjusting. He had made a friend, a merchant's son about his own age, who came to the market with his father 3 days a week, and who had the kind of cheerful relentlessness that Orion found worth engaging with. He was learning the city the way children learned anything, by throwing himself into it with a sort of comprehensive curiosity that didn't leave room for anxiety. "Do you miss it?" he asked one evening. He was working on his letters that she was teaching him herself, not from lack of funds now, but because the habit of teaching him had not been something she was willing to outsource. She looked up from the table where she had been reviewing a set of territorial maps she'd borrowed from the Merchant Council's library. "What?" "Home," he said. "Thornkeep." She looked at the map for a moment. "I miss some things," she said honestly. "What things?" "The library, the garden on the east side, the view from the upper terrace in the morning." "Do you miss Papa?" She considered this. "I miss who I thought he was," she said, "which isn't the same thing." He processed this. His pen scratched across the paper. "I miss the kitchen dog," he said. "The big gray one." "I know. Do you think he's okay?" "The dog?" "Yes." "I think the dog is fine," she said. "Dogs are resilient." "What's resilient?" "It means you're hard to break." He wrote a letter, looked at it, wrote it again. "Are we resilient?" he said. She looked at her son bent over his work in the lamplight, 6 years old and asking the right questions, and she thought about 5 days in the rain and a blister that had gone clean through and 60 silver marks, and Tasca Miran's face when she spoke for 8 minutes and changed the direction of a 6-month negotiation. "Yes," she said. "We are." It was 4 months later, winter fully settled over Aldenmark, when the letter arrived. She didn't recognize the seal. She turned it over twice in her hands. Dark blue wax, a device she didn't know. A wheel and a branch, stark and formal. The handwriting on the exterior was precise. Serena Vale. Care of Miran Trade Consortium. Aldenmark. No title, just her name. Inside, 2 paragraphs in a careful hand. "I am Counselor Anya Drest of the Silver Corridor Administrative Council. Your name has been suggested by 3 separate parties as someone with uncommon ability in complex territorial negotiation. We are facing a crisis of infrastructure and political alignment that threatens the stability of 6 cities and the trade routes connecting them. If you're interested in discussing a consulting arrangement, I would welcome a meeting in Vithara at your earliest convenience. The matters at hand are substantial. The compensation would reflect this." She read it twice. She set it on the table. She stood at the window and looked at the courtyard below where Orion's friend was throwing a ball against the wall with methodical persistence. And she thought about a map and a river access dispute and 3 foreign trade delegates and everything she had been quietly building a map of for 4 months. Then she picked up the letter and went to find Tasca Miran. "Someone wants to hire you away," Tasca said, reading the letter. "Or wants to offer me something significantly larger than what I'm doing here," Serena said. "The Silver Corridor is a mess. Has been for years." "I know. If you go, I lose the best arrangement I've ever made with a consultant, and you probably end up dealing with 6 city councils who will each believe they're the only important one." "Yes." Tasca handed the letter back. She looked at Serena the way she had started looking at her about 6 weeks in, with a quality of attention that was something close to respect, though she expressed it like a person examining a structural beam for load capacity. "What do you want?" Tasca said. Serena thought about this for a moment. "I want to build something large enough that people can't pretend it doesn't exist," she said. "What I'm doing here has been necessary. It's been good practice, but it's not the scale I'm thinking at." "And the Silver Corridor is?" "The Silver Corridor is a doorway," Serena said. "What's on the other side of it might be what I'm actually looking for." Tasca was quiet for a moment. "Whatever you were before you came here," she said. "I don't need to know what it was, but it was something bigger than this." "Yes," Serena said. "And you got thrown out of it." "Yes." And now you're going to build your way back to something. Serena looked at the letter in her hand, the seal, the wheel, and the branch. Not back, she said. Forward. I'm not going back to what I had. I'm going to something that makes what I had look small. It was 3 days later. She was 2 hours from Aldenmark, Orion asleep in the hired coach, the letter from the silver corridor folded in the pocket of her traveling coat, when the second rider caught them. He was riding hard, which was the first thing wrong. The second thing wrong was the Thornkeep seal on his saddle blanket, barely visible in the evening light, but unmistakable. She had spent 7 years seeing that seal every day. The driver pulled up without being asked. The rider's approach was too direct to pretend not to notice. The man pulled alongside and looked at her through the coach window. He was one of Darius's household riders, younger than she remembered, breathing hard from a long, fast ride. "Luna Vale," he said, and then caught himself. "Lady Vale." "I'm neither anymore," she said. "What do you want?" "I have a message from Alpha Thorn. He asks—" The rider paused, and she could see him deciding how to say it. "He asks that you return." The coach was still. Orion slept against the far door. The evening settled around them, cold and very quiet. "He asks," she said. "Yes." "Not commands, not demands." "No." She looked at the Thornkeep seal on his saddle blanket. "Why?" she said. "Why now?" The rider's jaw tightened. He was clearly delivering a message he hadn't been given context for, and he clearly knew the limits of what he could offer her. "I wasn't told the details," he said. "Only that the situation in the pack has changed, and that he—" Again the hesitation, "that he wants you back." She held the rider's gaze for a long moment. Then she looked at the letter in her pocket. Then she looked at the road ahead, winding south into the dark. "Tell Alpha Thorn," she said carefully, with the quiet of someone who means every syllable, "that I received his message." "And your answer?" She settled back in the coach seat. She tapped twice on the roof. The driver clicked at the horses, and the coach moved forward. "My answer," she said, as they pulled away, "is that he'll know it when it matters." The rider called something after them. She did not look back. Orion stirred at the movement and settled again, one hand pressed flat against the seat. In the failing light, she could see the pale silver of his eyes half open for a moment, and then closing. She pulled the letter from her pocket. The Silver Corridor, 6 cities, a crisis of infrastructure and political alignment that threatened the stability of a region. Her hands, in the dark of the coach, were completely steady. Whatever Darius had discovered, whatever had changed in Thornkeep to make the man who had signed her exile reach backward through 4 months and 2 territories for her, it had not arrived in time. Something had shifted in the pack. The rider's face had carried the particular tension of someone returning with news from a situation that had gone wrong, and she did not yet know what was wrong, and she was 2 hours into a road going south, and she had a meeting in Vaethra and an empire that existed so far only in the geography of her thinking. And there was a name she still did not have, the name of the person who had forged her signature, copied her seal, and built a case against her over months of patient, careful work. The name of the person still inside Thornkeep walls. The name of the person who, if the pack situation had changed, was either exposed or more dangerous than before. She folded the letter and put it back in her pocket. She had not yet figured out which. The rider's horse was still audible behind them when Serena pulled the Silver Corridor letter from her pocket a second time and held it without reading it. She already knew what it said. She had memorized it the first time, the way she memorized everything that mattered, not deliberately, but because her mind kept returning to useful things and wearing grooves into them. What she was actually doing was waiting to feel something about what had just happened. Darius had sent for her. She turned the feeling over. It was smaller than she expected. Not absent. There was something there, a low heat in the chest that she recognized as old and complicated, but small. 4 months ago, standing in that courtyard in the rain with his silence at her back, she thought she would spend the rest of her life trying to make sense of what he had chosen. Now a rider had come from Thornkeep with soft words and a request, and her primary reaction was to note that whatever had gone wrong in the pack had gone wrong fast enough that he'd sent someone after a coach on an open road without even telling the rider why. That was information. She folded the letter. Outside the coach window, the road south was dark and narrowing between close-grown trees. Orion breathed steadily against the far door. She could afford to wait. She could not afford to be distracted. Vithara was 2 days' travel from Aldenmark. Not a large city, but dense, built up into the hills above the eastern trade road, the kind of place that had been important for a very long time and knew it. The Silver Corridor's Administrative Council kept offices there because Vethara sat at the geographic center of the 6 cities it connected, which was practical thinking. Serena approved of practical thinking. Counselor Anya Dress met her in a ground-floor office that looked out onto a courtyard where 3 bureaucrats were arguing over a set of papers, with the weary intensity of people who had been arguing about the same papers for weeks. Dress herself was younger than Serena had expected from the letter, maybe 35, with close-cropped dark hair and the particular kind of stillness that Serena associated with people who had learned to conserve energy, because everything around them was always consuming it. "You came faster than I expected," Drest said. "I had already started south," Serena said. "Coincidence?" "Preparation. I'd been tracking the corridor situation for about 3 months." Drest's expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. She gestured at the chair across from her desk. "Sit." Serena sat. Orion, who had been awake for the last hour of the journey and was now operating on the theory that if he stayed very quiet and very still, no one would ask him to wait outside, settled into the chair beside her without making a sound. Drest glanced at him. "My son," Serena said. "How old?" 6. Drest looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not quite readable, then returned to Serena. "The situation is more urgent than the letter indicated," she said. "The letter was written 3 weeks ago. Things have moved." "Show me," Serena said. What Drest showed her over the next 2 hours was a situation that had the quality of a structure that had been badly maintained for a long time and was now failing in several places simultaneously. The Silver Corridor's 6 cities were connected by 3 major trade roads and 2 river routes. The road infrastructure had been jointly maintained under an agreement that was 40 years old and had never been updated to account for the growth in traffic volume. 2 of the 3 roads were now degrading faster than the maintenance levies could repair them. Simultaneously, 2 of the 6 cities, Vithara and a city called Senwick in the south, had been in a dispute over water rights for 18 months that had begun to affect trade relations between them. And the corridor's largest external trading partner, the Morden territories, had recently changed its internal governance in ways that were not yet entirely legible, but that had already disrupted 3 existing trade agreements. "Why haven't the cities resolved this themselves?" Serena asked. "Because they each believe the problems are primarily the other city's fault," Drest said, "and because the council's charter doesn't give us direct enforcement authority. We can recommend, we can mediate, we cannot compel." "So you need someone who can compel without having the charter authority to do it." "I need someone who can make 6 city councils believe that cooperating is in their individual interest rather than just their collective interest, which is a different thing." "Yes," Serena said. "It is." She looked at the maps on Drest's desk. 6 cities, 3 roads, 2 rivers, a structure that was 40 years old and cracking at the joints, a large trading partner in the middle of something that wasn't yet fully visible. "What happened with Morden?" she said. Drest's mouth tightened. "We don't entirely know. The old council was replaced. The new governance is," she paused, "less predictable. We've had 2 delegations return without concluding anything." "But has anyone spoken to whoever replaced the old council directly?" "They've declined to receive delegations." "Have they declined to receive consultants?" Drest looked at her. "What's the distinction?" "A delegation carries the weight of whatever politics sent them. It signals a position before anyone said anything. A consultant is," Serena paused, "a private individual seeking a private meeting." Drest was quiet for a moment. "You'd go to Morden." "Eventually. First, I'd fix the road maintenance agreement because that one is actually solvable, and getting something solved quickly changes the temperature of everything else." Then the Vithera-Senwick water dispute, because I've read the original water rights documentation in the corridor archives, and there's a provision in it that neither city has apparently noticed. Then Morden. There was a long silence. Outside, the bureaucrats in the courtyard had apparently reached some kind of conclusion and dispersed. "You've read the corridor archives," Drest said. "I borrowed them from the Alden Marsh Merchant Council Library. They had a partial set." "You did this before I contacted you. I told you I'd been tracking the situation." Drest leaned back in her chair and looked at Serena the way you look at something you're trying to decide how to categorize. "Who are you?" she said. "And I don't mean your name." "I'm someone who spent 7 years running the internal politics of a large and complicated organization and then lost access to it through no failure of competence," Serena said, "and I'm now available." "Why did you lose access?" "Politics. Someone else's or yours?" "Someone else's. Mine were better." The silence stretched. Orion, who had been following this conversation with the focused attention of a child who understood that something important was happening, shifted slightly in his chair. Drest looked at him again, then back at Serena. "My offer is," she started. "I don't want an offer yet," Serena said. "I want to see the road maintenance agreement in full. The original, not the summary. And I want the complete file on the Vithera-Senwick water dispute. After I've read those, I'll tell you what I want." Drest's eyebrows rose slightly. She had the look of a person who was accustomed to being the most organized person in any given room and had just encountered evidence that she might not be. "The files are available," she said. "Good. And I'll need a place for my son and me to stay while I'm working, something adjacent to the council offices. Proximity matters when you're moving fast." Drest looked at her for one more moment. Then she stood up and went to the door and called for someone in the hallway. Serena looked at the maps on the desk while they waited. The road maintenance agreement took her 6 hours to read, which was 4 hours longer than Drest's summary had suggested, and 3 revelatory provisions more than anyone at the council had apparently noticed in 40 years. She read it at the desk they gave her in the council's eastern reading room, Orion asleep on a folded blanket in the corner with his coat for a pillow, and she made notes in a tight, precise hand on paper the council provided. What she found was this. The original agreement had not actually divided maintenance costs equally between the 6 cities. It had divided them proportionally to usage, which 40 years ago had been approximately equal, but which 40 years of differential growth had made significantly unequal in ways that nobody had bothered to recalculate. 2 of the cities, neither of them Vithara, had been systematically under-contributing for at least 15 years. Not through malice, apparently, just through nobody updating the calculation. She set down her pen and sat for a moment with this. It was the same thing she had seen over and over. Not corruption, not conspiracy, just the accumulated weight of people not checking what they assumed was still true. Structures built on old math that nobody had recalculated, because recalculating it would require admitting that what they currently believed was wrong. People would do almost anything to avoid that admission. She knew how to use that. Not to embarrass anyone. Embarrassment made people defensive and defensive people dug in, but to offer them a way to discover the problem themselves and frame the correction as a natural update rather than an accusation. She went back to work. The Morden problem, she was beginning to understand, was the one that had the most reach. The cities could fix their internal issues, road levies, water rights, maintenance calculations, and still be vulnerable if their largest external trading partner was becoming unpredictable. Whatever had happened in Morden's governance change needed to be understood before anything else could be properly stabilized. She started pulling everything available on the new Morden Council. It took most of a second day and the assistance of 3 council archivists who were skeptical about her until she answered 2 of their questions in ways that demonstrated she actually knew what she was asking for. By the end of the second day, she had a picture, incomplete but coherent, of a governing council that had replaced a more open, trade-oriented leadership with a more closed, consolidation-oriented one. They weren't hostile to the corridor exactly. They were re-examining every existing relationship and deciding which one still served them, which meant they could be talked to. They just needed to be approached as equals, not as a partner requesting reassurance. "You're thinking about Morden," Drest said. She had come into the reading room in the early evening, which Serena was beginning to understand was her pattern. She let people work and checked in at the margins of the day. "I'm thinking that the Morden situation isn't a trade problem," Serena said. "It's a status problem. The new council doesn't believe the corridor treats them as a peer. They have a larger economy than 4 of our 6 cities combined." "Right. And your delegations arrived representing an administrative council with no enforcement authority, asking them to please continue honoring agreements they associate with the previous leadership. How did you expect that to land?" Drest was quiet. "You need to go to Morden," Serena said, "with someone who can offer them something new, not the continuation of the old agreements, a renegotiation, something that acknowledges the shift in their position." "And you think you can do that?" "I think I can get the meeting. What happens in it depends on what they actually want. And if what they want is something we can't give, then we find out what they'll take instead," Serena said. "That's the whole job. Finding what's actually on the table." She saw something cross Drest's face then. Not quite relief, but the particular shift of someone who has been holding a weight for a long time and just felt someone else's hands on it. "The road agreement," Drest said. "You said you'd found something." "3 things. I'll write them up tonight. The first 2 you can present to the council yourself, which I'd recommend. It carries more weight coming from you than from someone they've known for 10 days. The third one you'll want me in the room for because it requires walking them through a calculation that's going to be uncomfortable for Renwick and Dalt." "Those are the 2 cities that have been under-contributing." "Yes. They're also the 2 cities with the most contentious council representatives." "I know." Serena looked back at her notes. "That's why I'd like to be in the room." What happened over the following weeks did not feel, from the inside, like anything as clean as a series of victories. It felt like work. The particular dense, repetitive work of moving large, slow things by increments so small, you sometimes couldn't tell if they were moving at all. She prepared the road maintenance analysis and watched Drest present it to a joint council session that ran 3 hours over schedule because Renwick's representative, a man named Hassel, spent 90 minutes insisting that the original calculation was fine and the problem was road quality, not usage weighting. She sat against the wall and waited until Hassel had exhausted himself, arguing against a position nobody else was fully taking, and then she asked for the floor. "Councillor Hassel," she said, "what year was the usage calculation last updated?" "That's not relevant. I'm asking because I'd like to know if you know." The silence in the room was the particular silence of people hoping the answer about to emerge isn't as bad as they're afraid it is. "The agreement is 40 years old," Hassel said stiffly. "That's when it was written. I'm asking when the usage calculation was last updated." He didn't answer. The answer was it hadn't been. They both knew it. "If the calculation were updated using current usage data," she said, "Renwick's contribution would increase by 11%. Over 10 years at current road degradation rates, the cost of not updating it is approximately 3 times that 11%. I'm not suggesting Renwick has done anything improper. The agreement doesn't require updates, it just permits them. But I am suggesting that Renwick's long-term interest is in roads that don't fail, and roads that don't fail require accurate maintenance funding." Hassel looked at her for a long moment. "Who are you?" he said. "A consultant." "For whom?" "For the corridor," she said, "which includes Renwick." The road maintenance vote passed 6-0, with Renwick and Dalt abstaining rather than opposing, a better outcome than Drest had privately predicted. Afterward, in the hallway, Hassel found Serena near the exit. "You framed that as being in our interest," he said. "It is. You also made me look like I hadn't done the math." "You hadn't?" He looked at her. He was a big man, heavy-set, with the kind of face that had spent years projecting authority and didn't quite know what to do when it wasn't working. "I don't like being outmaneuvered." "I wasn't maneuvering you," she said. "I was giving you a better option than the one you arrived with. If you want to discuss the difference, I'm available." He looked at her for another long moment, then left without responding. She watched him go and noted that he hadn't been hostile exactly. He had been recalibrating. That was workable. The message from Thornkeep arrived on a Tuesday. Not a writer this time. A formal letter, council seal, delivered through the Vethera postal system with the careful bureaucratic neutrality of something official. She recognized the handwriting on the address. Brecht, the counselor who had found something to look at on the middle distance the morning she left. She opened it. Lady Vale, the matter that caused our previous correspondence has become significantly more urgent. New evidence has come to light concerning the accusations against you. Alpha Thorn requests your presence at Thornkeep at the earliest possible date to address matters of consequence to the pack and to your name. I write to you directly as someone who... She stopped reading, folded the letter, placed it on the reading room table. New evidence, which meant something had shifted in Thornkeep, something that was making the architecture of her exile look unstable. Brecht writing to her directly, not through official channels, meant he was moving carefully, which meant whatever was happening was not yet resolved, which meant someone was still in play inside those walls. The name she didn't have. She sat with this for approximately 3 minutes. Then she picked up her pen and continued working on the Morden approach brief. Whatever was happening in Thornkeep would continue happening whether she went back now or not. She could not investigate from inside those walls. She had no standing, no position, no legal presence. She was an exiled former Luna, and a former Luna returning at the Alpha's soft request was not the same thing as going back with something that couldn't be ignored. She was not going back with less than that. Orion found her still at the desk 2 hours later when he returned from the council building's courtyard, where he had spent the afternoon with the archivist's daughter, a girl of about 8 who had taken a proprietary interest in him. "You got a letter," he said, seeing the folded paper on the desk. "Yes." "From home?" She looked at him. He had been saying that less often recently. Home. Thornkeep was becoming something he talked around rather than toward. "From Thornkeep," she said. He climbed into the chair across from her. He looked at the letter. He looked at her. "Are we going back?" he said. She thought about the question with the honesty she always tried to bring to his questions. "Not yet," she said. "But eventually?" "Eventually," she said, "we'll go back to settle something. What we settle there depends on how big we've become between now and then." He thought about this. "How big are we now?" She looked at the brief she was writing, the Morden analysis, the Vithara Senwick water provision, the 6 cities and the cracking roads, and the 40-year-old agreement that nobody had bothered to recalculate. "Bigger than we were," she said. "Not big enough yet." He nodded. He picked up a spare piece of paper and started drawing what appeared to be a horse. She turned back to the brief. She was 3 paragraphs from the end of the Morden section, working through the specific framing of the new trade terms she wanted to propose, the language that would let the new council accept them without appearing to have backed down from any position they'd staked out. When the door opened and Drest came in at an angle that was not her usual late-day check-in angle, Drest had a second letter in her hand. Her face was carrying something she hadn't been wearing when Serena had seen her 3 hours ago. "A delegation arrived an hour ago," Drest said. Serena set her pen down. "From where?" "Morden." Drest placed the second letter on the desk. "They didn't send word ahead. They've requested an emergency session with the Corridor Council tomorrow morning." Serena looked at the letter. The Morden seal, she recognized it now from her research, heavy black wax with a pressed coin device. "What's the emergency?" "The letter doesn't say. The delegate who delivered it," Drest paused, "said only that it concerns the Corridor's relationship with the Pact territories to the north." The air in the room changed, or rather, something in Serena's chest changed, and the room felt it. The Pact territories to the north. "How many delegates?" she said. 4. They're staying at the Stonehouse Inn. The lead delegate is listed as... Drest checked the exterior of the envelope. "A man named Vale, senior trade envoy." Serena looked at the letter she had received from Thornkeep, the one still folded on the desk. New evidence. Alpha Thorn requests your presence. Whatever had changed in Thornkeep had apparently expanded its radius. The ripple had already reached Morden, or Morden had been watching Thornkeep and waiting for something to move, and now something had. She stood up. "I need to be in that meeting tomorrow," she said. "You're not a council member." "I know. Find a title that gets me in the room. Observer, advisor, staff consultant, Whatever works inside your charter. She picked up the Thornkeep letter and the Morden letter and held them both. These two letters are connected. I don't know exactly how yet, but they are. And if I'm not in that room when the Morden delegation speaks tomorrow, you're going to end up with a conversation you don't fully understand. Dress looked at her for a moment. What aren't you telling me? She said. It was a fair question. Serena had been waiting for it. I left the North under circumstances that are in the process of being reconsidered, she said. Something has changed in the Pact territories, and now Morden, which borders those territories, has sent an emergency delegation here. She looked at Dress directly. I don't know yet whether my past is a complication or an asset in that room tomorrow. What I know is that I understand the Northern Pact territories better than anyone on your council does, and I understand Morden's current political situation better than anyone else in this building. You need both of those things tomorrow. The silence held for 3 full seconds. Staff consultant, Dress said. I'll have the paperwork done tonight. After she left, Serena sat for a moment without moving. Orion had stopped drawing. He was watching her. Something happened, he said. Something is happening, she corrected. Past tense would mean it was done. Is it bad? She thought about the Morden delegation arriving without warning. She thought about Thornkeep and new evidence and a name she still didn't have. She thought about everything she had built in the past months and how none of it was large enough yet. How she was still close enough to the edge that a shift in the wrong direction could undo it. She thought about the morning the gate closed, the rain, the 43 people who let it happen. It's not bad, she said. It's an opening. She picked up her pen. Go to sleep. I have 2 more hours of work. He looked at her for a moment longer, assessing, the way he always did, with those silver-gray eyes that gave away everything his face was trying not to. Then he folded his drawing and climbed onto his blanket on the reading room couch and closed his eyes. She turned back to the brief and wrote the last 3 paragraphs with a speed and precision that surprised even her, because somewhere in the last 5 minutes, the picture had clarified. The Morden delegation had not come to negotiate a trade dispute. They had come because the political map of the North was shifting, and they wanted to know which way to face when it finished shifting. They were going to want to know what she knew. And tomorrow morning, in a meeting room in Vithara, for the first time since the gate at Thornkeep had closed behind her, she was going to have something they needed badly enough to pay full price for. She set her pen down and looked at the 2 letters on the desk side by side. Thornkeep and Morden, past and leverage. And she understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that she was done being in the position of responding to what other people decided. Tomorrow she stopped responding. Tomorrow she moved first. The Morden delegation arrived at the council chamber at the 9th hour exactly, which told her something. People who arrived exactly on time to emergency sessions they had requested were people who had prepared for this meeting more carefully than the emergency framing suggested. Serena sat at the far end of the council table in the chair Dress had arranged for her, staff consultant, the paperwork said, which gave her a seat and no vote and the right to speak when recognized. She had dressed with deliberate plainness. Dark wool, no ornamentation, hair pulled back. The choice was not modesty. It was the choice of someone who wanted to be underestimated for the first 20 minutes, and then stop being underestimated all at once. The lead delegate was the man named Vial, 50, compact, with the watchful quality of someone who had spent a career in rooms where the wrong word had consequences. He took the seat across from Dress, scanned the faces at the table in the practiced way of someone cataloging, and when his eyes reached Serena, they stopped for exactly 1 beat longer than the others before moving on. He knew who she was. She had expected this. She filed it and waited. Dress opened the session with the formal language of the corridor charter. Vale listened with his hands flat on the table, which was a posture Serena associated with controlled impatience, the posture of someone who had something to say and was enduring the preamble. Counselor Dress, he said when she had finished, I appreciate the formalities. The matter I've come to discuss requires plain speaking. Plain speaking is welcome, Dress said. The Thorn Pack has requested Morden's recognition of a new trade agreement, one that would route northern goods through Morden territory rather than through the Silver Corridor. He paused, letting this settle. The terms they've offered are favorable to Morden. The implications for the corridor are significant. The silence in the room had a particular quality. Serena watched the 6 city representatives process this in real time. The small, involuntary shifts, the glances toward Drest, the particular stillness of people trying not to look as alarmed as they felt. She kept her own face even. The Thorn Pack, Drest said, has existing agreements with the corridor. Which is precisely why I'm here rather than simply accepting their offer, Vale said. We wanted to understand the full picture before making any commitments. Serena looked at him. He was being truthful, she thought, mostly. The diplomatic phrasing carried the quality of a man who had come to gather information as much as to deliver it. Morden hadn't decided yet. That was the opening. Counselor Drest, she said. May I ask a question? Drest looked at her, then at Vale. Our consultant has been working on corridor-Morden relations specifically. Delegate Vale, do you have any objection to her participating? Vale's eyes came back to Serena. Something moved behind them. No objection, he said. She leaned forward slightly. What is the Thorn Pack offering Morden in exchange for routing the northern goods through your territory? A 5-year exclusivity arrangement on northern mineral exports. And, he paused, assistance with the eastern border situation. The eastern border situation. She had seen that in the research. A low-level territorial dispute between Morden and its eastern neighbor that had been unresolved for years. Military assistance then, or the promise of it. That was a different kind of offer than trade terms. That was the Thorn Pack leveraging its military position, which meant Darius was not simply renegotiating old agreements. He was making new ones, aggressively. He was reorienting Thornkeep's external relationships, which was not the behavior of a pack that had recently exiled its Luna and moved on smoothly. It was the behavior of a pack that was in some kind of internal difficulty and was reaching outward to stabilize. She thought about Brecht's letter, new evidence, things of consequence to the pack. How recent is this offer? She said. We received it 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago was approximately 2 weeks after the rider had caught her coach on the southern road. Whatever had shifted in Thornkeep, it had shifted fast enough that within 2 weeks Darius was making military-adjacent offers to foreign territories. That was not the behavior of a man who had simply reconsidered his judgment about his wife. That was a man who was being pressured. She sat back and spent the rest of the session listening, which was its own kind of work. Filtering, cataloging, building the map of what was actually happening behind what was being said. By the time the session ended, she had a clearer picture than she had started with, and the picture was more complicated than she had hoped. Afterward, in the corridor outside the chamber, Vile fell into step beside her with the deliberate casualness of someone who had been planning to do exactly this. You're Serena Vale, he said. Yes. Former Luna of the Thorn Pack. Former, yes. You've been in Vethara for, he calculated, less than a month. Long enough, she said. He walked with her for a few steps without speaking. The corridor was long, stone-floored, the sound of their steps oddly distinct in it. The offer from Thornkeep, he said, came through an intermediary rather than through official channels. That was the first thing that struck us as unusual. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. What intermediary? She said. A man named Calder. He described himself as acting on behalf of the Alpha's council. He was, Vale chose his word carefully, persuasive, and specific in ways that official delegations rarely are. He knew details of Morden's eastern border situation that aren't public. Calder. She turned the name over. She did not know a Calder in Darius's household. She had known every significant player in Thornkeep before she left. Calder was not one of them, which meant he was either new or operating under a different name while she was there, or he was someone from outside who had been brought in specifically to manage this negotiation. This man Calder, she said. How old? What does he look like? Vale studied her face. Why? Because the offer from Thornkeep is not what it appears to be, and the man who brought it to you may not represent who he says he represents. The silence stretched long enough to have weight. He was perhaps 40, Vale said. Dark, clean-shaven, he spoke with an accent from the Western Territories, not Thornkeep native. Not Thornkeep native. Someone brought in. Someone specifically recruited to manage Morden outreach. She started walking again. "Whatever you decide about the Thornpack offer," she said, "I'd suggest you take another 3 weeks before committing. Things in the north are not settled." "You sound certain of that." "I'm certain of what I know," she said, "which is more than it sounds like." She did not sleep well that night. This was unusual for her. She had developed the ability to sleep with workmanlike efficiency in difficult circumstances over the past months, because she had learned that not sleeping was a resource expenditure she couldn't afford. But this night her mind kept circling, the way it circled around things it couldn't quite see the edges of. Calder. The offer. The eastern border leverage. 6 weeks after a rider caught her coach and she sent him away empty-handed. Something had broken loose inside Thornkeep, and whatever it was moving. She got up before dawn and sat at the desk and wrote a letter to the one person in Thornkeep she was reasonably certain still had both the access and the motivation to tell her the truth. Not Brecht. Brecht's letter had been cautious in ways that suggested he was managing his own exposure. She wrote to Maida instead. Her attendant of 4 years who had stood with her eyes on the cobblestones the morning of the exile, and who, Serena had noted even then, had been the only person in the courtyard whose hands were shaking. Not from grief. Serena had thought, even in that moment, that the shaking had a different quality, but she had been moving toward a gate and hadn't been able to stay with it. She wrote carefully. Not a request for information about the pack situation. That was too dangerous to put in a letter. She wrote about Orion. She mentioned that he had made a friend. She mentioned that they were well. She left a return address for the Vithara council offices. At the bottom, she wrote, "I remember that your hands were cold that morning. Mine weren't. I've thought about why." She sealed it and handed it to the council's Morning Post courier and went to find Orion and breakfast. The response came in 11 days, which was fast for a letter from the north. Fast enough that Maida had been waiting for an excuse to write, or had started writing before the letter arrived. Serena read it at the desk in the reading room with the door closed. Orion at council offices across the building, learning mapping with one of the junior archivists who had adopted him with the enthusiasm of someone who had always wanted a pupil. "Lady Vale, I am glad you and Orion are well. I think of you often. The house has changed. I do not say this to cause distress, but because you deserve honesty from at least one person, and I have owed you honesty for longer than I said. I was frightened that morning. I have been frightened for longer than that morning. There's a man here now named Calder, who arrived 8 months ago as a trade advisor to the council. He is not what he says he is. I do not know exactly what he is, but I know that before he came, the evidence against you did not exist, and after he came, it did. He knows things. He knows how to find things that should be private and make them appear public. He has the Alpha's ear in ways that should require years, and he achieved in months. I didn't speak before because I was afraid, and because I did not know what I knew. I only knew that something was wrong in a way I couldn't prove. By the time I understood it was worse than I thought, you were already gone. Please be careful. He asked after you twice in the past month, not with concern, with the attention of someone tracking something they've set in motion. M. She read the letter 3 times. Then she set it flat on the desk and pressed both palms against the surface and looked at the wall and let the full shape of it land. Calder, 8 months ago, trade advisor. The evidence against her had materialized months into his tenure, and now he was reaching outside Thornkeep, to Morden, apparently, with an offer made in Darius's name, while simultaneously tracking her movements. This was not a man who had built a case against her and considered his work done. This was a man who was still operating, who had removed her from Thornkeep and was now using the absence he had created as part of something larger. The Morden offer was not Darius making desperate overtures because his pack was in trouble. The Morden offer was Calder using Darius's authority, or someone's approximation of it, to restructure the North's external relationships while the political interior of Thornkeep was still in the disruption Calder himself had caused. He had removed her. He had destabilized Darius's authority by exposing the exile as unjust. That was what the new evidence was, she understood now. Not a vindication of her, but a tool, something that would make Darius's position precarious, and make the pack look for steadier ground elsewhere. And now he was filling the vacuum with his own deals, his own alignments, using Thornkeep's name like a seal on documents he was writing himself. She thought about the rider who had caught her coach. He asks that you return. Darius had sent for her because Darius was losing ground, and he knew it, and he thought she was still the kind of person who would come back to help him hold it. She had not gone back. Had that been the right call? She pressed her palms harder against the desk. The wood was solid and cold. The question of whether it was the right call was now irrelevant, because whatever was happening in Thornkeep was not going to wait for her to be large enough. Calder had already reached Morden. He was, she thought through the geography, in a position to do significant damage to both the pack and the corridor before anyone with the full picture could intervene, and right now she was the only person who had anything approaching the full picture. She picked up the letter and read it again. He asked after you twice in the past month, not with concern, with the attention of someone tracking something they've set in motion. She had been tracked. The rider on the road had not been sent by a man overcome by regret. Or not only that, someone had known which direction she had gone. Calder, or someone working for him, had known she was in Aldenmark before the letter from Drest arrived. And when she came south to Vethera, the Morden delegation had followed within days. He knew where she was. The question was what he intended to do about it. She stood up and went to find Drest. Drest was in the main council office reviewing the road maintenance documentation. She looked up when Serena came in, and whatever was in Serena's face made her set the documentation down. "What happened?" Drest said. Serena closed the door behind her. She sat down. "I need to tell you something about where I came from," she said, "and why it's now directly relevant to everything this council is dealing with." She talked for 20 minutes. She gave Drest the necessary facts without excess: the exile, the forged evidence, the name Calder, Maida's letter, the Morden meeting reframed through what she now understood. Drest listened without interrupting, which Serena had come to understand was her habit in high-information situations. She collected everything before she responded. When Serena finished, Drest was quiet for a long moment. "This man Calder," she said, "if he's operating with Thornkeep's authority but not actually under Thornkeep's control, then the agreement he offered Morden may not be sanctioned by the Alpha, which means if Morden accepts it and it later unravels, Morden has a grievance against a pack they've been misled by, and the corridor is sitting between two unstable entities. And if Calder has anticipated that you'd surface this, he has," Serena said. "He knows I'm here. He's been tracking me." The words sat in the air between them. Drest looked at the closed door with the expression of someone recalculating the safety of a room they had previously felt secure in. "What do you need?" Drest said. "I need to go to Thornkeep," Serena said. "Not at Darius's request. On my own terms, with the corridor's formal standing behind me. I need to go as a recognized diplomatic representative of the Silver Corridor to the Thorn Pack for the purpose of clarifying the Morden offer and verifying its legitimacy. If I give you that standing, then I'm not a disgraced former Luna returning at her husband's summons. I'm a foreign representative with legal presence on Thornkeep territory, which is the only position that gives me protection and authority at the same time." Drest looked at her steadily. "This is personal for you," she said. "The man who framed you is inside those walls." "Yes." "And your former husband is the Alpha." "Yes." "That's not a simple diplomatic situation." "No," Serena said. "It's not. But I'm the only person who can navigate it, because I'm the only person who knows all the layers of it. You know that." Another silence. Drest picked up a pen and set it down without writing anything. "If this goes wrong," she started. "It won't go the way Calder has planned it," Serena said. "That's the only guarantee I can offer." Drest looked at her for a long moment. In the quiet, somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed, and footsteps moved down a corridor and faded. "I'll need 2 days to prepare the formal credentials," Drest said finally. Serena nodded. "And I want regular correspondence. If you go silent for more than 5 days, I act on the assumption that something has gone wrong." "Agreed." "And Serena." Drest's voice shifted slightly. Not softer exactly, but more direct in a different way, the voice she used when she was talking about something actual rather than strategic. Orion stays here. The words landed with a precision that took a breath to absorb. She had known this. She had known it before she came into this office. Orion could not go back to Thornkeep. Not without standing, not while Calder was inside those walls, not while the political situation was as unstable as it was. He was her son, and he was also 6 years old, and he was the single greatest vulnerability she had. And the only way to protect him was to leave him somewhere that wasn't in Calder's reach, which meant leaving him. "He'll be safe here," she said. "I'll personally ensure it," Dress said. "He can stay in the council residence. The archivists have already adopted him." Serena looked at the window. The courtyard was empty in the afternoon light, just stone and the shadows of the upper buildings crossing it at long angles. 2 days, she said. She told Orion that evening. She chose honesty over cushioning, the way she always did with him, because she had started with honesty on a muddy road in the rain when he was 6 and scared. And she was not going to stop now because the truth was harder. "I have to go north," she said, "to Thornkeep." He looked at her across the dinner table. The lamp between them made his face very clear. "To fix it?" he said. "To try." "Is it dangerous?" She considered this with the honesty she owed him. "It could be," she said. "It's why you're staying here." His jaw tightened. Darius's jaw, doing what Darius's jaw did. And she could see him working through the thing he wanted to say and deciding whether to say it. "I don't want to stay here without you," he said. "I know." "But you're going anyway." "Yes. Because you have to. Because I'm the only one who can." He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He was 6, and he had been doing something 6-year-olds weren't supposed to have to do, which was understanding that the person who made him feel safe couldn't always stay where he was safe. "Okay," he said. Not happy, not convinced, but trusting her, the way he had trusted her on the road in the rain, through some internal reasoning that arrived at her competence before it arrived at her reassurance. She reached across the table and covered his hands with hers. "I'm going to go," she said, "and I'm going to finish something, and then I'm going to come back and tell you how it ended." He nodded. "Promise?" he said. "Promise," she said. She left on the 3rd morning. The road north was cold and clear, and she traveled with 2 of the corridor's formal outriders, the outward sign of the credentials Drest had prepared, the thing that transformed her from a woman on a road into a representative of a recognized political entity. She had the documentation in a case beside her in the coach. She had Maida's letter in the inner pocket of her coat. She had not slept more than 4 hours the night before, not from fear, but from the particular alertness of someone who is approaching something that has been a long time coming and wants to be fully awake for it. She thought about Calder, the way she thought about problems she couldn't yet fully see, by approaching the edges of them, testing the shape, trying to understand the logic. He had taken months to build the case against her. He had been precise, thorough, and patient. He had used Darius's authority as a vehicle and had positioned himself close enough to the center of it that by the time the evidence surfaced against her, Darius had received it through channels that appeared entirely legitimate. He was smart. He planned ahead. He tracked his exposures. He had been tracking her, which meant he knew she was coming, or would know, very soon. She looked out the coach window at the northern road stretching ahead. The trees here were familiar in a way she hadn't expected. The particular angle of the light through this kind of forest, the way the shadows fell in the morning in these latitudes. Her body remembered this country before her mind finished thinking about it. She was 40 miles from Thornkeep when the coach stopped. She felt the driver slow before she heard why. Then she heard the horses, other horses, multiple, coming fast from the north. She reached for the case with the corridor credentials instinctively. The outriders exchanged words with someone she couldn't yet see. Then one of them came to the coach window. "Lady Vale," he said. "Pack riders. 6 of them. They say they have a message." She looked past him. 6 riders in Thornkeep colors stopped across the road in a loose line. Not a greeting formation, not the posture of messengers. The lead rider separated from the line and came forward. He stopped 10 feet from the coach, and she could see his face clearly. Someone she did not know, which was itself important information. "Serena Vale," he said. "Not lady. Not my lady. Just the name." stripped of everything around it. "Yes," she said, "you are requested to accompany us to Thornkeep as a person of interest in an active investigation." The words took a moment to resolve into meaning. Not invited, not welcomed, not received, requested to accompany. Person of interest. Active investigation. She looked at the man's face for a beat that stretched long enough to have texture, and she saw in it what she was meant to see: certainty, official weight, the calm of someone executing a prepared instruction. He had been told what to say, and he was saying it. Behind him, the other 5 riders had spread into a configuration that had nothing casual about it. Calder had known she was coming, and Calder had moved first. She opened the coach door and stepped down onto the road with the credentials case in her hand, and the corridor seal visible on it, and she looked at the 6 riders, and at the road ahead, and at the road behind. And she understood with the totality of someone who has just run out of the last available version of the plan she came with that every choice she made in the next 30 seconds was going to determine whether she finished this or got swallowed by it. The name she had spent months searching for was inside those walls, and now so was the trap. She did not step back. That was the first decision, and it was made before she had consciously made it. Her body simply refused the retreat, the way a wall refuses pressure, not through strength, but through the absence of any inclination to move. She stood on the road with the credentials case in her hand and looked at the lead rider and let the silence stretch until it had enough weight to mean something. "I'm a formal representative of the Silver Corridor Administrative Council," she said. "The documentation is in this case. Before anyone does anything they'll need to account for later, I'd suggest you look at it." The lead rider's eyes went to the case. He had been given instructions, but instructions written in advance never quite fit the situation they encounter, and she could see him recalibrating. "Our instructions," he started. "Your instructions were written before this case existed," she said. "Take it to whoever sent you. I'll wait." She held the case out toward him with the steadiness of someone who is not offering a concession but presenting a fact. The corridor seal on the exterior was unmistakable: deep blue wax, the wheel and branch device, formal enough that ignoring it had consequences. The rider looked at it for 3 full seconds. Then he took it. He conferred with the man to his right in a low voice she wasn't meant to hear but did anyway. 8 years of court life had trained her ears for exactly this kind of deliberate undertone. The second man was uncertain. The lead rider was calculating exposure. Neither of them had been given instructions for a scenario where the woman they were detaining had foreign diplomatic credentials. "We'll escort you to Thornkeep," the lead rider said finally. "The Alpha will review your documentation." "The Alpha," she said. "Not Calder." The second rider's face moved. Just slightly. Just enough. "The Alpha," the lead rider said with the flatness of someone confirming something he didn't want confirmed. She got back into the coach. The outriders from the corridor fell in on either side, which nobody objected to, which told her that the 6-pack riders didn't want an international incident any more than she did. The road north resumed. The forest thickened and then thinned and then thickened again, and she sat in the coach with her hands in her lap and her breathing even and her mind running at a speed that had no outward expression. Calder had anticipated her arrival. That meant he had a source, either in the corridor's administrative offices or in the postal route. And that meant the timeline she had was probably shorter than she'd thought. He would know she was coming with credentials. He would be adjusting. The question was what adjusting looked like from where he was standing. He had already made the Morden offer using Darius's authority. He had already surfaced the new evidence about her exile, not out of justice, she understood now, but as a tool to destabilize Darius's position and make the pack look toward whoever was providing stability. If Darius was weakened by the revelation that he had exiled his Luna on false charges, and if Calder was positioned as the steady hand in the council, and if the external relationships Calder had been building, Morden, potentially others, were in place before anyone understood what he'd done, then the pack's power structure shifted without anyone having to do anything dramatic. It was elegant. It was the kind of plan that worked precisely because it never required anything that looked like a coup. Just a series of reasonable-seeming events, each one individually explicable, adding up to something irreversible. She was the one thing he had not fully accounted for. She had been out of reach, and then she had been building something of her own, and now she was arriving with the weight of a foreign entity behind her, and a letter from Maida in her pocket, and a clear picture of the architecture of what he'd done. She was the piece of his plan that hadn't stayed where he'd put it. People who built elegant plans were most dangerous when those plans were disrupted, because they improvised differently than people who worked rough. They improvised with precision, which meant they were harder to predict. She needed to move faster than his adjustments. Thornkeep appeared through the tree line in the late afternoon, and for a moment the sight of it hit her with a physical force she hadn't prepared for. The walls she had walked in every day for 7 years. The towers she had watched the light change on in the morning from the upper terrace. The eastern gate that had closed behind her in the rain. Her body remembered this place at a level below thinking, and what it remembered was complicated in ways she didn't have time to sort through. She sorted through none of it. She filed it. The gate opened for the escort. The courtyard inside was not the same courtyard she had left. Same stones, same dimensions. But the people in it arranged differently, the energy in it different. She read it the way she read all rooms, immediately and without announcing that she was doing it. There were more guards than there used to be. They were stationed at different intervals than pack protocol called for. Someone had changed the security arrangement, and the change had the feel of something recent and nervous. Darius met her in the receiving hall, not the council chamber. That was a choice. The receiving hall was formal enough to signal significance, but not so formal as to signal that this was an official proceeding, which meant he was trying to control the framing before the framing got away from him. He looked different than she remembered. Not older exactly. It had only been 9 months, but reduced somehow, in the way structures reduced when you could see where the stress was being carried. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there. He stood the way he always stood, with the physical authority of a man who had been alpha long enough that it was in his body rather than his posture. But underneath it, something was working harder than usual. He looked at her for a moment that went on longer than protocol called for. "Serena," he said. "Alpha Thorn," she said. He absorbed this. She watched him absorb it. "You came with corridor credentials," he said. "I came as a representative of the Silver Corridor Council to clarify the terms of an offer made to Morden using your name," she said. "That's the formal reason I'm here. I'd like to begin with the formal business and the informal business. Can wait until the formal business establishes what kind of room we're in." Something moved across his face. She had spent 7 years learning the vocabulary of his expressions, and this one was a composite she hadn't seen before. Something between recognition and something raw, something that had the quality of a man seeing the shape of his own mistake from the outside for the first time. "The council chamber," he said. "Yes," she said, "and I'd like to know who's in it before we go in." His jaw tightened. "Calder will be present. He's—" "I know what he is," she said. "I want to know who else." He told her. 7 council members, 3 senior advisors, Calder. She filed the names, noted which ones she knew from her time as Luna and which ones were new, and walked beside Darius down the corridor she had walked 1,000 times, her footsteps on stone she knew the sound of, toward a confrontation she had been building toward for 9 months without knowing the name of it. The council chamber was exactly as she remembered it. Long table, high windows, the particular quality of light in the late afternoon that came through the western glass and laid itself across the stone floor in long amber rectangles. 7 faces turned toward her as she entered, and she read them all in the first 3 seconds. Uncertainty, calculation, something that might be shame, something that was definitely wariness. And at the far end of the table, a man she had never seen before. 40, as Vial had said. Dark. Clean-shaven. Still in the particular way of someone who had trained himself to be still because stillness was useful. His eyes found hers the moment she entered the room, and they were the eyes of someone who had been expecting her and had decided what to do about her before she arrived. Calder. She had been carrying the shape of him for 9 months. The forger, the architect, the name she didn't have. And now he had a face, and the face was unremarkable in the way that made her more cautious, not less. Remarkable people announced themselves. People who had done what he had done were usually people you would not notice until it was too late to notice. She sat in the chair that was indicated, not the Luna's chair, which had been removed from the table, but a visitor's chair to the left of Darius. She set the credentials case on the table. She did not look at Calder again immediately. She let him watch her, not looking at him. The Silver Corridor Council, she said, addressing the room, has received a proposal from Morden referencing a trade and security agreement offered by the Thorn Pack. Before any decisions are made about the corridor's response, we require confirmation that the offer was made with the full knowledge and sanction of Alpha Thorn and the Pack Council. The silence had a texture. She could feel Calder in it the way you feel a change in pressure before weather. The offer was made on behalf of the Pack, Calder said. His voice was measured, even, the voice of a man who spoke carefully as a habit. I handled the approach to Morden as part of my responsibilities as trade advisor. Under whose specific authorization, she said. The Council's. He looked at Darius. Which the Alpha approved. Darius's hands were flat on the table. She saw them without looking directly at them. Alpha Thorn, she said. When did you review the specific terms offered to Morden? The pause was half a second too long. The terms were presented in summary in the council session, Darius said. The full terms, she said. The military assistance component regarding Morden's eastern border dispute. Another pause. Longer this time. The military components were discussed separately, Calder said, before Darius could answer. She looked at Calder for the first time since she had entered the room. Directly, completely, the way you look at something you have been studying from a distance and are now close enough to see clearly. Separately from the Alpha, she said, or separately from the Council. This is not a corridor matter, Calder said. Pack military arrangements are internal. They become a corridor matter when they are used to draw a corridor trading partner into a security arrangement that affects the regional balance, she said. And they become this Council's matter when the person who arranged them is not the person he told Morden he was. The room went very still. She reached into the coat pocket and placed Maida's letter on the table. She did not unfold it. She just placed it there. I have a witness statement, she said, from within this household, attesting to the timeline of Counselor Calder's arrival, his access to the Luna's private correspondence and documentation systems, and the subsequent emergence of the evidence that resulted in my exile. I also have, she opened the credentials case, a formal statement from the Morden delegation currently in Vithara, describing the circumstances of Calder's approach to them, including his use of documentation that they have since confirmed was not formally issued through Pack Council channels. She set the second document on the table beside the letter. I'm not here to relitigate my exile, she said. I'm here because a man who manufactured the grounds for that exile has spent the 9 months since then using the political disruption he created to build a set of external relationships that serve him, not this pack. And the corridor needs to know whether the Thorn Pack is a reliable partner or whether it's been speaking with two mouths. The silence was now the kind that filled the whole volume of the room, pressing into the corners. Calder spoke first. Of course he did. People who built careful plans attacked when disrupted, because attack was the only move that bought time for recalculation. This is a disgraced former Luna, he said, returning with foreign backing to interfere in Pack governance under the cover of diplomatic credentials. The Council should consider what it means that the corridor is inserting itself into internal Pack affairs through a woman who was removed from her position for cause. The cause was your fabrication, she said. That's an allegation without... I have the documents that prove it, she said, not allegations. The original correspondence templates you used. The dates of access on the Luna's seal records, the financial transfers that funded your presence here before the Pack formally engaged you. She looked at him steadily. I've had 9 months with nothing to do but figure out who you are. I used the time. Something shifted in Calder's face, just slightly. The stillness developed a hairline fracture. Darius stood up. It was not the movement of a man who had been waiting to speak. It was the movement of a man who had reached the edge of something he had been approaching for a long time and had finally arrived at it. He stood at the head of the table with the physical weight of an alpha, and when he spoke, his voice had the quality she remembered from when she had first met him, before the years of politics had built their layers over it, when he had been simply a man who meant what he said. Calder, he said. You told me the Council authorized the Morden security component. Alphas, answer that specific question. A beat. The Council was informed of the general approach, Calder said. That's not what I asked. Darius looked at him the way you look at something you've trusted and are now seeing differently. Who in this room was told the specifics of what you offered Morden's eastern border situation? Name them. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. No one at the table spoke. Because no one at the table had been told. She could see it on their faces. The particular expression of people who are realizing in real time that they authorized something they didn't know they were authorizing, and are now doing the math on what that means. Calder's jaw moved. He was recalculating. She could see it happening. I acted in the PAC's best interest, he said. The corridor arrangements were limiting our external options. The Morden relationship needed to be expanded. You acted in your own interest, Darius said. His voice had gone flat and cold in the way she recognized. The Alpha Register, stripped of the diplomatic layering, the voice he used when he had already decided something and was no longer in discussion. Using my name. Using this PAC's name without authorization. Alpha Thorn. Calder's voice changed, still measured, but underneath it something tighter. Consider what you're doing carefully. I have relationships with Morden that this PAC needs. If you... Arrest him, Darius said. The two words fell into the room with total finality, and for 1 second nobody moved, and then the guards at the chamber door moved, and Calder turned to face them with an expression that had dropped every layer of performance and revealed something underneath that was calculating the cost of resistance. He looked at the guards. He looked at the table, at the letter, at the corridor documents, at the witnesses around it. He looked at Serena. She met his eyes. In them she saw the things she had been trying to understand for 9 months. Not malice, exactly, but a kind of ruthless practicality that had no floor to it, no level below which it would not go. He had removed her because she was an obstacle to something he was building, and he had built it carefully and patiently, and it had almost worked. Almost. He was taken out of the chamber. The doors closed. The room breathed. Darius sat back down. He looked like a man who had just set down something very heavy and was assessing the damage done by carrying it. The council members at the table had the specific quality of people who needed time they were not going to get to process what had just happened. Counselors, he said, I'm calling a full review of every external agreement and communication issued in the past 12 months. Nothing is confirmed until it's been verified through proper channels. He looked around the table. We'll recess for 1 hour and reconvene. The council members filed out. She remained in her chair. When the room was empty, except for the two of them, the silence had a different quality. Not the political silence of a moment ago. Something older. Darius looked at the documents on the table. How long have you known about him? He said. 3 weeks with certainty, she said. 9 months with something I couldn't yet name. And in Vithara, I was building a case and a position, so that when I came back, it wasn't as a suppliant. He was quiet for a moment. Serena. He said her name the way he hadn't said it when she came in, not like a formal address, not like a title, like her name. Don't, she said. I need to... Shh. Not yet, she said. There's still work to do in this room before we have any personal conversation. The Morden situation needs to be formally documented and notified. The corridor needs a statement. The PAC Council needs a full accounting of what Calder actually arranged and what can be unwound. She picked up the credentials case. After all of that, if you have something to say to me, say it then. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was the composite she still couldn't fully name. Regret, recognition, something that had the quality of a man confronting the specific shape of his own failure, not in the abstract but in the face of the woman he had failed. Orion, he said, is safe. He's in Vithara. I know what you want, she said. We'll discuss it after. She stood up. She gathered the documents. She walked to the chamber door and put her hand on the handle. The PAC accounts, she said, without turning around. I'll need access to verify what Calder committed in the PAC's name. Full access. Tonight. You'll have it, he said. She opened the door. The corridor beyond it was the same stone corridor she had walked for 7 years. The guards who had taken Calder were somewhere below in the holding rooms. The council members were dispersed through the building, each of them privately reckoning with the last 2 hours. The documents in her hand were the foundation of a proceeding that would take weeks to complete. She walked the corridor and felt the weight of the building around her. Familiar and foreign at the same time, belonging to her and not belonging to her, the way places feel when you've been away long enough that you've changed, but they haven't. She was halfway down the hall when the door to the side chamber opened and a man stepped out. Not Calder. Someone she didn't know. Young, pack colors, the specific look of someone who had been given instructions and was only now realizing the instructions might be wrong. "Lady Vale," he said. "I was told to—" "To what?" she said. He looked at the papers in his hand, his own papers she could see now, with a seal she recognized from Calder's documentation. Her stomach understood before her mind caught up. "To deliver this," he said. He was uncertain. He was a messenger, not a conspirator. She read that immediately. Someone who had been handed something and told to hand it on and had not asked enough questions. She took the paper. It was a single page. Clean handwriting, no seal on this one, dated this morning. And what it contained took her 3 seconds to read and another 3 to fully process, because what it contained was not a message to her. It was a message to someone outside Thornkeep, written this morning before Calder was arrested, in anticipation of exactly the proceeding that had just occurred. A contingency. She read it again. The name at the bottom, the recipient, was in Morden. Not Vale. Someone else. Someone whose role in the Morden governance change she had not yet fully mapped. And the content of the message was not a threat and not a negotiation. It was a set of instructions, timed to execute if Calder did not check in by nightfall. Instructions that named Orion. The paper in her hand was perfectly steady, because her hands were trained by 9 months of holding things steady when every instinct wanted to react. And that training was the thing that had kept her alive and functional through everything that had come before this moment. But inside her chest, something went cold in a way that had no floor to it, dropping through all the levels of what she'd prepared for and landing somewhere below. She looked at the messenger. "How long ago were you given this?" she said. "An hour, my lady. Maybe a little. How were you to know if you should deliver it or not?" "I was told if Counselor Calder didn't come to me himself before the evening bell, I should—" She was already moving. Down the corridor, past the chamber doors, past the guards at the main hall entrance who stepped aside because she was moving with the kind of velocity that didn't invite questions. Through the eastern passage and to the exterior courtyard where the corridor outriders were still stationed with the horses. "We ride for Vithara," she said. "Now." The senior outrider looked at her face and did not ask why. The gate opened. The horses hit the road at a pace that was not diplomatic and not measured, and she rode with the paper in her coat and the cold thing in her chest, and 50 miles of darkness between her and her son, and she thought about what Calder had built. Not just the scheme, but the depth of it, the contingencies inside the contingencies, the careful architecture of a man who had designed for the scenario where everything failed and still wanted to leave a mark. He had designed for her. He had known, even from inside a holding room, that she would win the council chamber. And he had built a last move that didn't require him to be present to execute. She rode harder. The evening bell had not yet rung. She did not know how far the messenger in Morden was from Vithara. She did not know if Drest's guards were enough, or if whoever Calder had placed in Morden had already moved, or if she was riding towards something she could still stop. What she knew was that she had not come this far. 9 months, 2 territories, 60 silver marks, and a boot that bled through the heel, and a 6-year-old who slept against doors in cold way stations and asked if they were resilient, to arrive at the end of it and find she had left her son unguarded. The road south was black under the horses' feet. The wind was cold and direct, and the stars were hard and clear. Behind her, Thornkeep's lights were already small. Ahead, 50 miles of night. She rode. She heard Orion before she saw him. His voice, high, clear, carrying the particular irritated edge of a child who had been confined somewhere longer than he considered reasonable, reached her through the council residence's front door before she had finished dismounting. The sound of it hit her somewhere below the sternum, and the cold thing that had been living in her chest for 50 miles of hard riding dissolved so abruptly that she had to put one hand on the horse's flank to steady herself. She went through the door. Orion was in the front room with 2 of Drest's household staff and the archivist's daughter, and he was in the middle of what appeared to be a significant disagreement about whether he was permitted to go out to the courtyard. He turned when the door opened, and his face went through 3 expressions in about 1 second: surprise, relief, and then the particular expression of a child who has been frightened but refused to admit it, and is now confronting the fact that the fear was real. He crossed the room and hit her at full speed. She caught him and held on. He was fine. He was completely fine. Dressed's people had received her message. She had sent a rider ahead from the halfway point with instructions to double the guard on the residence and not let Orion leave the building for any reason. And they had executed it without question, and nothing from Morden had reached Vithara in time. And her son was in her arms with his face pressed into her shoulder, and his fingers gripping her coat with a force that suggested he had been doing the math on worst-case scenarios for the last several hours. "I'm here," she said. "You rode fast," he said, muffled. "Yes." "Did you fix it?" She held him for a moment longer before answering. "Most of it," she said. "The rest is in progress." She set him down and looked at him. He had a smear of ink on his jaw from what had apparently been an intense session of cartography with the archivist, and his hair needed cutting, and he looked at her with those silver-gray eyes that had always seen more than a 6-year-old's eyes had any right to see. "What's left?" he said. "The last part," she said, "which I have to go back for." He looked at her steadily. Then he nodded, once, with the gravity of someone who has decided to trust a plan they can't fully see, because the person presenting it has earned that. She stayed in Vithar for 3 days, not from hesitation, from necessity. The Corridor Council needed her account of the Thornkeep proceedings. Dress needed the formal documentation chain completed before the Morden situation could be properly addressed. The instructions Calder had sent, the contingency letter naming Orion, needed to be formally entered into the evidentiary record because it established both the scope of Calder's operation and the deliberateness of it. That last part was important. There was a difference, legally and politically, between a man who had built a scheme and a man who had built a scheme with a prepared action against a child as a failsafe. The distinction mattered for what came next. She wrote the account herself, by hand, in the reading room where she had spent the last weeks building the Corridor's road analysis and the Morden brief. The room looked the same. She was not the same person who had first sat in it. She noticed this the way you notice a change in altitude, not dramatically, just as a fact of pressure, a difference in what the air required. On the 3rd morning, Drest came in while she was reviewing the final documentation. "The Morden delegation has agreed to suspend the Thornkeep offer pending a full review," Drest said. Vale was, she paused, not surprised when he heard about Calder. I think he had already suspected the offer wasn't entirely clean. "He mentioned Calder's approach struck him as unusual," Serena said. "He also asked about you." "What did he ask?" "Whether you would be available for the renegotiation of Morden's Corridor partnership." Dress set a cup of tea on the desk beside Serena's papers. "I told him I'd ask." Serena looked at the documentation in front of her. Then she looked out the window at the courtyard where Orion was finally in the open air, running some kind of complicated game with the archivist's daughter that seemed to involve a great deal of chalk on the cobblestones. "After Thornkeep," she said, "there's more to finish there." "Yes." Drest was quiet for a moment. "You know what they're going to offer you." "I know what Darius is going to offer me." "And?" Serena picked up her pen and made a final notation on the document. "And I know what I'm going to say," she said, "which isn't the same as what he's expecting." She rode back to Thornkeep on the 5th day, this time without urgency, without the cold thing in her chest driving the pace. Orion rode beside her on the small bay horse that the council's stable had been lending him for lessons, and he rode with the careful, focused posture of a child who was taking the skill seriously, which was how he took everything. The road north through the forest looked different in the daytime without panic. Just trees, just light, just the ordinary passage of ground under horses' feet. She had ridden this road in 4 different states of mind now. Exiled, building, threatened, desperate. And riding it this way, measured and clear-eyed, felt like something she had earned rather than something that had simply happened. She thought about Calder in Thornkeep's holding rooms, which was where he had been for 5 days now. She thought about the particular kind of man who built what he had built, the patience required, the capacity to treat other people as variables in a calculation rather than as anything more weight-bearing than that. She had encountered this type before, in her years as Luna, in the foreign courts she had navigated in Darius's name. They were not uncommon. What was uncommon was encountering one who had been given enough time and proximity to do as much damage as this one had. That was the thing she had kept returning to in the quiet spaces of the last 5 days. Not the betrayal itself. Betrayal was a fact of any political life, and she had known this long enough that it had stopped surprising her in the abstract. What she kept returning to was the specific texture of this one, the months of careful construction, the patience of someone who understood that large structures required sustained effort, the willingness to wait. He had used her own traits against her, her system, her access, her documentation habits, her credibility, all of it reverse-engineered and weaponized. There was something almost instructive in the efficiency of it, and the cold way it demonstrated how thoroughly someone could be used as material by a person who saw them only as that. She did not find this comforting. She found it clarifying. She had spent 9 months becoming someone who could not be used that way again. Not through bitterness. Bitterness was a wall, and walls stopped everything, not just the things you were afraid of. Through understanding. She understood now the specific shapes of her vulnerabilities, which was the only kind of knowledge that actually protected you. Orion pulled up beside her. "Are you thinking?" he said. "Yes." "About Thornkeep?" "About a few things." "Are you scared?" She considered the question. The trees thinned ahead, and the shape of Thornkeep's eastern tower appeared against the sky, catching the afternoon light the way it always had, the way it had every morning she had watched it from the upper terrace before the world changed. "No," she said, and meant it. Darius received them in the private study, not the council chamber, not the receiving hall. The private study was a room she had sat in 100 times, a working room, books on 2 walls, the desk he had used since before she knew him, the particular smell of old paper and the cold hearth. He was standing when they came in, which meant he had been standing for a while, which meant he was more unsettled than he intended to appear. He looked at Orion. The look lasted only a few seconds before he brought his face back to neutral, but she saw what moved through it. Not just recognition, but something that cost him something to contain. Orion stood beside her in the doorway of a room he had been in many times as a smaller child, and he looked at his father with the silver-gray eyes that were his father's shape and her color, and he did not run across the room, and he did not look away. He was 6, and he had learned things about the world that 6-year-olds shouldn't have to learn, and one of those things was that love did not exempt you from being failed by someone. "Orion," Darius said. "Alpha Thorn," Orion said. It was what he had heard Serena call him. She had not told him to say it. He had arrived at it himself, through whatever careful internal reasoning he did when he was working through something that mattered, and the effect of it on Darius was visible in the slight tension around his eyes, and the way his breath shifted before he steadied it. "Sit down," Serena said to Orion, nodding toward the chair near the bookshelf where he had always sat when this room was normal. "I'll talk to you after." He sat. He pulled a book off the nearest shelf, Shutki, not randomly, she noticed, but deliberately, already reading the spine before he opened it, and he folded himself into the chair and let the room be what it needed to be. She stood across from Darius. "Calder's in holding," he said. "I know. The council has reviewed 6 months of correspondence. The full scope of what he was doing," he paused, "is larger than what you documented. He had 3 external contacts we hadn't identified. He'd been moving pack resources through unofficial channels." "I know," she said again. "Brecht sent me the preliminary inventory last night." He looked at her. "Brecht's been in contact with you." "Brecht wrote to me 2 months ago. He was the one who first told me the evidence against me was being reconsidered. He didn't have enough then to act on. He does now." Something shifted in Darius's face. Not surprise. He had moved past being surprised by what she knew. Something more complicated. The expression of a man who is accounting for the full length of something, measuring it against himself and finding the measurement unflattering. "I signed your exile," he said. "Yes, without asking me anything I couldn't answer," she said. "Yes." He was quiet. This was the conversation she had known was coming since the rider caught her coach on the South Road 9 months ago, and she had thought about it in many different forms during those 9 months. The version where she needed him to understand the scale of what he'd done. The version where she needed him to feel it. The version where she said things she had been saving. Standing in this room now with Orion reading quietly in the corner, she found that almost none of those versions were what she actually wanted to do. What she wanted was simpler and harder than any of them. "Darius," she said, "I'm not going to list what you did. You know what you did. If you don't know by now, nothing I say in this room changes that." He looked at the floor, then back at her. "I believed what was in front of me," he said. "I chose to believe it. That's—" He stopped. "There isn't a way to say that that doesn't sound like I'm excusing it." "No," she said. "There isn't. I wanted to believe the pack was stable, that the threat was external, that it was you because if it was you, I understood where the problem was, and I could contain it." He said this with the flatness of someone who has already said it to themselves enough times that the self-deception in it is no longer deniable. "If it was inside my own counsel, inside my own house, then I hadn't been seen clearly for long enough to feel safe in anything I'd built." "You hadn't," she said. He absorbed this. "I know," he said. "I know that now. What you do with knowing it," she said, "is not my responsibility. That's the part that belongs entirely to you." He was quiet for a long moment. The room settled around them. In the corner, Orion turned a page. "I want you to come back," Darius said. Not the careful diplomatic phrasing of the letter he'd sent through Brecht, not the formal request he'd had the writer deliver. Just the statement, direct, with the particular weight of someone who has run out of more palatable ways to say a true thing. She had known this was coming. She had thought about her answer, and standing here, looking at the man she had married and built 7 years with and been failed by in a way that had remade her entirely, she found the answer was both simpler and more final than she'd expected. "I know you do," she said. Then, "I'm not coming back as your Luna," she said. "That's not what I am anymore. And I think if you're honest with yourself, you know that what you want isn't me as I was. It's the stability I represented, the competence, the political weight I carried. You want what I could do for this pack, and you've dressed it as wanting me back, and I think you believe that, but they're not the same thing." He opened his mouth and closed it. Because she was right, and they both knew it. And there was a kind of exhausted relief in a true thing being said plainly, after so many months of everything moving sideways around the truth. "What I'm offering," she said, "is this. The Silver Corridor will formalize a diplomatic relationship with the Thorn Pack. I will negotiate that relationship as the Corridor's representative, which means I have standing here, and access, and a role that is mine because I built it, and not because I was married into it. Orion will have a formal position as his father's acknowledged heir, with whatever contact between you that he chooses when he's old enough to choose it." She let this settle. The pack gets a stable external relationship with a significant territory. Orion gets the legitimacy he was born to, and I don't have to be anyone's Luna to make any of that work. Darius looked at her for a long time. "That's not the same as you being here," he said. "No," she said, "it isn't, but it's what's available, and it's better than what you had 3 weeks ago." He looked at the desk. He looked at his hands. He had the expression of a man who is learning what it feels like to receive something less than he hoped for and understand that it is still more than he deserves, and that the only dignified response to that is to take it without negotiating for more. "All right," he said. Calder's formal hearing happened over the course of 2 days, and she attended both days as the Corridor's representative, which gave her a seat at the proceedings that was official and unassailable. She did not speak often. The evidence spoke more efficiently than she could, and she had learned long ago that the instinct to be present in a room verbally was usually a need for reassurance rather than a strategic necessity. She watched Calder across the chamber floor. He had not broken. She had not expected him to. People who built what he had built didn't break in hearings. They pivoted, reframed, looked for angles. He found fewer than he had anticipated because the evidence was more complete than he had prepared for, and because she had spent 9 months on it with the uninterrupted focus of someone who had no other obligations to that specific task. On the second day, when the council delivered its findings, conspiracy against the pack, unauthorized use of alpha authority, falsification of evidence, and 3 additional charges related to the resource movements Brecht had uncovered, she watched Calder's face and looked for the moment when the calculation ended, when what he was looking at was the plain result with no remaining angle. It lasted about 3 seconds. Then his face went back to controlled. She found she felt almost nothing about him. Not triumph, not residual anger. The anger had been fuel for 9 months, and she had used all of it. What she felt now was something closer to the satisfaction of a long accounting finally balanced. The particular exhausted clarity of having finished something difficult and found the numbers came out correct. After the proceedings, Brecht found her in the corridor. He was older than she remembered, or maybe just more tired. He walked with her for a few steps in silence, the way people walked when they had something they needed to say and were gathering themselves to say it. "I should have spoken sooner," he said. "Yes," she said. "I was afraid," she said. "I know. I was there that morning. I watched." He was quiet. She could feel him sitting with the weight of it. "I'm sorry," he said finally. It came out raw, which she hadn't expected, and the rawness of it made her look at him. He was a man in his 60s who had spent his life in the service of this pack and had, when it mattered most, chosen his own safety over the truth. He had lived with that for 9 months. She could see it in him, not as a dramatic wound, but as the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying something you can't put down. She thought about what it cost to say that word plainly, without excuse, to a person you had failed. She thought about all the ways she had been rehearsing her own feelings about Thornkeep and everyone in it, and she thought about how carrying those rehearsals for 9 months had been its own kind of weight, one she was ready to set down. "I know," she said, "and I believe you." She did not say it was fine. It wasn't fine. Some things that weren't fine were still survivable, still workable, still part of what you built forward from rather than back toward. He nodded once, and they walked the rest of the corridor without speaking, which was its own kind of resolution. She found Orion in the eastern garden the evening after the hearing, sitting on the low stone wall with his sketchbook, drawing the tower. He had been drawing it for an hour by the look of it, working with the focused patience he brought to things he wanted to get right. She sat beside him and looked at the drawing. He had the proportions almost exactly correct, which was remarkable for a 6-year-old, and the particular quality of the late light on the stone was suggested in the way he had varied the pressure of his pencil, lighter at the top, heavier at the base where the shadows gathered. "It's good," she said. "The windows are wrong," he said. "I can't get the spacing." "Try counting them from the right instead of the left." He tried. The spacing improved. He studied it, then added 2 more lines. "Mama," he said, not looking up from the drawing. "Yes." "Are we going to live here again?" She looked at the tower. The light on it was the same light she had watched every morning for 7 years. The same stone, the same shadows at the same angle, in the same season. "Not the way we did before," she said. "But we'll come back sometimes." "Yes, we'll come back." "And Papa?" She thought about how to answer this with the precision it deserved. "Your father made a mistake," she said. "A large one. He knows it. He can't undo it, but he knows it. That matters." She paused. "What happens between you and him is something you'll decide for yourself when you're old enough to decide it. I'm not going to decide it for you." Orion considered this. He added a line to the drawing. "I think I want to know him," he said. "But not yet." "That's honest." "Is it okay that it's not yet?" "Yes," she said. "Time is something you actually have." He closed the sketchbook and held it on his lap and looked at the tower in the real light instead of the drawn light. "Where do we go after this?" he said. She looked at the eastern tower. She thought about the Morden renegotiation waiting in Vethara. She thought about 6 cities and cracking roads and the Silver Corridor's 40-year-old agreements and everything she had been learning to navigate in the months since she crossed the gray water with 60 silver marks in her coat. She thought about a woman who had walked through a gate in the rain with a child in a bag and had spent 9 months becoming something that couldn't be exiled, because what she was building didn't live inside any set of walls. South, she said. Back to Vithara first, then wherever the work is. Is the work good? It's hard, she said. Which is better than good? He thought about this. He seemed to find it satisfactory. Okay, he said. They sat for a while longer in the eastern garden, the tower throwing its long shadow across the stone, the evening settling in the way evenings settled at this latitude, slowly with a long blue transition before the dark. She was not comfortable exactly. Comfort was not the word for what she felt sitting in the garden of the place that had tried to end her story and failed. What she felt was solid. She felt the particular solidity of someone who has been tested at the foundation and found that the foundation held. Not because she was harder than the thing that tested her. She wasn't harder. She had been frightened and cold and wrong about things, and short on resources and alone in way stations in the dark. She had held herself together through all of that, not by being invulnerable, but by refusing to let the cracks become the whole story. That was the thing she understood now that she hadn't understood when she was Luna here, when she had authority and a title and a position that felt solid because it was held in place by someone else's power. Real solidity didn't come from what you'd been given. It came from what you built with the materials you actually had, in the conditions that were actually present, without waiting for better conditions. She had built something. It was not finished. It would not be finished for years. But it was hers in a way that nothing taken from her had ever been, because it could not be taken. No decree touched it. No gate closed it out. She stood up from the wall. "Come on," she said to Orion. "It's getting cold." He tucked the sketchbook under his arm and jumped down from the wall, and they walked back through the eastern garden toward the residence where they had been given rooms for the duration of the proceedings. And the light behind them went the long amber of late evening, and the tower's shadow stretched across the stones and finally lost itself in the general dark. In the morning, before the household was fully awake, she stood at the window of the room she'd been given and looked out at Thornkeep in the early light. The courtyards, the walls, the eastern tower catching the first of the sun the way it always had. She looked at it the way you look at something that was once the whole world, and has become a place, you know, which is a different thing. She had come back. She had done what she said she would do, in the dark of a way station with Orion asleep against her chest and 60 silver marks and a mind that refused to stop running. She had not done it for vindication. Vindication was a story you told other people, and she had stopped needing to tell that story somewhere between Alden Mark and Vithara, somewhere between the road maintenance agreement and Maida's letter and a single 8-minute conversation that changed the direction of a 6-month negotiation. She had done it because it needed to be done, and because she was the person available to do it, and because somewhere underneath all the practical necessity was the simple fact that she had not been willing to let what happened in that courtyard be the last sentence. It was not the last sentence. She turned from the window and picked up the leather document case, the corridor credentials, the Morden files, the draft framework for the new diplomatic agreement that she had been working on in the evenings between proceedings. She had a meeting with Darius's council in 2 hours to finalize the terms. After that, she had a letter to write to Vale. After that, she and Orion were going south. She picked up the case and went to wake her son. Outside, the sun came fully over the eastern wall, and the shadow of the tower shrank back toward its base, and the courtyard filled with light, and Thornkeep, this place she had fought for and lost and returned to and renegotiated, and was now preparing to leave again on her own terms, looked exactly like what it was. A place she had passed through, one of many. She had learned to move. She had learned that moving was not the same as running. She had learned that what you carried was more important than where you stopped, and that what she carried now, the work, the mind that had built something from 60 silver marks and empty ground, the son who was already learning to count windows from the right, was not diminished by any of the places it had been. It was made of them, all of them, the gate and the rain and the way station and the cold heel and the 60 marks and Tasca Myron's flat appraising look and Drest's 2 days to prepare the credentials and the sound of 50 miles of dark road under a horse going too fast. She had needed all of it. She would not undo any of it. The woman who left with nothing had returned as something that had no title yet, because the titles she'd been given had all proven too small, and the one she was building was still in progress, and that was exactly right. She had work to do. She went to do it.